This is going to go viral, so be careful. One of the things you said is you worked with the offenders and the victims.
Yeah.
So kind of explain that dichotomy for me, because I'm not sure I could work with an offender. I'm not sure I can do that and honor them appropriately as a therapist, because I would have my own stuff wrapped up in that.
Honestly,
So I'm a combat veteran. I have PTSD. One of the things that was challenging for me was having this PTSD gave me a sense of safety for the insecurities that I have.
Yeah.
It's almost like anything that I might know that I'm not achieving at a way that I can be achieving at, well, I have an excuse for it, and it's this. And if I heal from it, then how scary is that?
I think sometimes people unintentionally self-sabotage, or this fear of like, when's the other shoe gonna drop? The only thing you can control is your own healing and what you do. Low resilience doesn't always look like the person who's like depressed or the person who is unable to function. Sometimes the most traumatized people are the most high achieving and externally successful people.
The Patina'd Podcast is about the earned wisdom bound in pain. It's about chasing failure, catching it, and using that as an opportunity. It's about scar tissue and sinew. It's about stretch marks and dented fenders and refusing to hide them. It's about pushing our insecurities and shame to the forefront instead of behind us. Instead of seeing rust as something that compromises a structure's integrity, we choose to see it as the grit that builds character. This is the Patina'd Podcast. Okay. All right. Well, welcome to another episode of the Patina'd Podcast. My guest today is Lauren Auer. Lauren is a mother. She's a wife. She's a trauma therapist, is how she's most well known amongst people other than her immediate tiny circle. And she's well known out in the Instagram sphere is how I became known or aware of you. And so really like the content that you've been putting out. But yeah, Lauren, so this show is around resiliency, is kind of the undertone or the theme of the show. And I thought, how awesome. You put out one specific quote that stood out to me. I'm like, oh, okay. So she's about resiliency too. I mean, obviously you work with trauma, but there's a specific quote that I'm like, okay. And so anyway, what I want to do is kind of, if it's okay, is kind of go back into some of your origin story. So I'm a therapist too. So like you, we probably like to go back to some of the beginnings of things and kind of what helped create the person to be who they are today.
Sure. Yeah. Well, I grew up here, when here is Central Illinois. And in my family, I had a lot of counselors. My grandfather was a counselor. So I kind of always saw myself going into that field. I was really drawn to it. But once it became time to apply for colleges and look at price tags, I kind of got freaked out by needing to get a master's degree and go that whole route. So I kind of switched my major in undergrad, and I switched it to criminal justice because that's what my mom did and she really loved it. And I thought, well, that's kind of like being a counselor, so I'll just go that route. And my internship in undergrad was in a juvenile detention center. So I was working with kids that, had broken some laws and had a lot of behavioral problems. But something that just stuck out to me so much at that time was how much trauma all those kids had, and how, at least at the time, it really wasn't being addressed much. And if it was very minimal and very secondary to behavior. And it was just like, I just couldn't get over that. So I decided, okay, I need to just do what I knew I wanted to do originally. So I, applied for grad school, went and got my master's degree in counseling. And in terms of working in trauma specifically, I kind of kept ending up unintentionally in these different internships and jobs that were very surrounded by different types of trauma. So my initial internship in grad school was working with juvenile sex offenders as well as victims of abuse and their families. And at the time, I really didn't want to work with kids at all. It just wasn't really what I was drawn to, but I ended up really loving working with that population. And I don't know, it was just very eye-opening in a really positive way for me. And I also then from there, I worked at a women's domestic violence shelter, and then I was a therapist at a rape crisis center. And then I eventually became the director of that therapeutic program in that center. So then I was, working with clients of all ages that have experienced abuse, and then also doing a lot of training and speaking as the director out in the community to help, secure grants and stuff. So I was speaking with a lot of medical professionals and police and different community members on things like vicarious trauma and compassion fatigue. And so I just ended up really kind of getting this like all-encompassing view of trauma, and then also leading a staff of 12 therapists who they themselves had their own secondary trauma, on top of helping other people. And in that agency, we served ages 2 all the way up to, 100. And so just seeing it at all these different ages and stages, and we would do on-call work. So sometimes we would go to the emergency room when there was like crisis situations.
Wow.
So seeing the juxtaposition of that crisis situation versus working with a client that was, elderly, that had experienced something way earlier in their life, it was just this really, really interesting viewpoint. And so I opened my own practice in 2020. And so that's kind of what I've been doing ever since.
Very cool. A wild year to open up your practice, 2020. It's a wild year. How was that?
Good one, huh?
Yeah. So did you open up prior to pandemic or as it was going on?
Yeah, I guess probably more so as a result of that.
Okay.
Maybe not fully directly. It was something that I had kind of wanted to do and had been dreaming about. And I think maybe the pandemic kind of gave me the push that I needed, because at that time, everything was changing, obviously. But, just there was a lot of changes in the agency I was working at that I wasn't getting to do the stuff that I really wanted to do as much. And I think I was just getting kind of being in a leadership position, especially during that time, and having to deal with so much and adjust. I was kind of getting burnt out on just being more in that role. And I was missing like the kind of like boots on the ground, like one-on-one therapy, that kind of thing. And so I think that was kind of my motivator to like, I just want to do this.
Yeah, I can relate. I feel like, I'm not sure if this is like the origin story or the beginning story of every therapist that goes out on their own and does a private practice deal, but it seems like the kind of mixture of I'm not getting to do the things I want to do, along with a little bit of burnout by doing the things that you don't want to do, seems to kind of allow this creativity to happen where you're like, well, what if I opened up something? What would that look like? And kind of gets things going. I just wanted to take a quick pause and genuinely thank you for getting this far through the episode. This podcast is very small if you haven't noticed. So every like, every comment, every follow or subscribe, it really makes a difference. So my only request from you is to interact with the content if you like it. Like and follow, rate and review, and share if you feel like this is something that's worthy of sharing. Thank you so much. You said like your plan B was still in the helping others business, right? Like, so it seemed like you knew that was whatever direction you were going to go to, this had to be the theme for you of helping other people. So that's interesting to me as well. How old were you when you began to feel like, okay, this is maybe my calling, or this is a path or a direction for me?
Gosh, I was young. I think maybe late grade school or middle school, I think. And it honestly wasn't really something that I like sat down and thought about. It was kind of just like I always knew or assumed that was what I was going to do. I think some of that was just like in my personality. I felt like a lot of times with friends and, family stuff, I kind of ended up being like the one that could see things from other people's perspectives and like the voice of reason. And I enjoyed that. And it was just kind of very natural to me. And then I think, of course, seeing like my grandfather do it and stuff, it was something that I looked up to him for as well.
Yeah. And is your grandfather still with us, or is he passed on?
No, he passed away, oh gosh, a couple years back, maybe 2019, I think it was.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
And so it sounds like he had a pretty major role in your life, not just in terms of like career path, but also just in terms of like how he was as a person. So yeah.
Yeah, it was really interesting, actually. I remember I was lucky that before he passed away, he was sick for a while, but I was already kind of starting the dreaming and the thoughts about starting my own practice and was able to talk to him about some of that stuff. And I remember at his funeral, or the visitation specifically, there were so many people there that were like former clients, or he taught counseling too. So former students and, people he had mentored. And it was just like very, I guess, validating to me to see like, oh, wow, like he really made this impact on so many people. And it kind of like gave me that motivation to be like, no, like keep going. It's hard opening your own business and stuff. But yeah, I definitely think that was part of that journey of me opening my own thing.
Yeah, I don't know if you do this, or maybe I'm just the morbid one, but like I envision that, like when I'm dead and my funeral happens, I envision like, okay, who's going to speak of me in the way that I would like them to speak of me, not just because I'm dead and they're doing the cliche, let's honor him because he's dead sort of thing, but because I was genuinely a good man to somebody, or genuinely helpful to somebody in a time of need. So that's really cool how your grandfather got that. It's like, here's my life's work,
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that stood out to me is, so you said when you first started working within the counselor role from beyond the juvenile thing, I also really related with, I kind of laughed because I never wanted to work with teens either. Never. It's like they're just too chaotic. And then as it seemed like God opened this path for me that I couldn't turn away from, and then I'm working with teens, I realized like the teens aren't my big fear here. It's actually their parents or their caregivers. That's the ones that
Right.
really need the work.
Yeah.
So that, but yeah, one of the things you said is you worked with the offenders and the victims.
Yeah.
And as your career continued to progress, you continued to stay the route with the victims, or as I heard you just say it. So kind of explain that dichotomy for me, because for me as a therapist, I'm not sure I could appropriately work with an offender. I'm not sure I can do that and honor them appropriately as a therapist, because I would have my own stuff wrapped up in that. So how was that for you, working with both sides of the coin? And you're seeing somebody hurt and traumatized by an offender, and now you're working with an offender who also is traumatized, most likely from their past, but they've also victimized, right? So
I wonder sometimes if it, because I get asked that from time to time, and honestly, it never was really that hard for me. And I think maybe because I started in criminal justice, and that was like my foundation, was seeing, kind of beyond the offense to the humanity of those kids, that was my initial foundation. I think that probably did help. And I think too is I've done a little bit of work with adults in terms of offenders, but most of it has been with kids. And I think for me, I'd probably have a harder time with adults. I think that with kids, at least, their brains aren't fully developed. There's like all these extra things kind of working against them, that it was never hard for me to really develop, I guess, that compassion towards them. And also at the same time, holding them accountable, while also addressing the hurt. And I think that at least when I was doing that work, I saw how impactful that was, that I think a lot of times the people they were working with kind of, bypassed anything that was their own hurt. And honestly, I think that really held a lot of them back from really changing their behavior or healing. And so, yeah, I mean, there's definitely a difference there, but it also gave me this interesting perspective. I think, a lot of, not all, but a lot of times with the victims that I've worked with or do work with, it's not uncommon that, well, it's actually very common that the offender is somebody that they know and usually trust and is part of their life in some capacity. And so a lot of times there's a lot of mixed feelings that the victims have towards the offender, and they're not always all bad feelings. And so I think, I guess kind of in both ways, my work with offenders helped me understand that more, because I had also seen all those sides. And then I think also help then validate and understand, the healing process on the victim side of being able to kind of hold space for all those emotions. I think, it's easy when you just think of, a victim and an offender to kind of think good and bad, right? But it's usually not that simple. And I'm really thankful for the time that I was able to work with offenders, because I think that really helped me move past any of those like biases that I maybe would have had I not.
Kudos to you, because, they're human, they need help too. And then it's about finding the right person that's compassionate enough to be able to serve that community. Yeah. And for me, I think I'm self-aware enough to know that I wouldn't be able to do it, the counter transfer sort of deal. I mentioned I became aware of you through Instagram, and the video that it was the pin brain spotting video, where you're looking past and you're looking through the pin and you're looking through the pin and all that. And I'm a brain spotter myself. And so maybe that's why it showed up on my algorithm. But so you work obviously within somatic therapies. I saw you made a joke recently about, I can't remember exactly how it went, but it was something like, you confessing to once being a CBT, using CBT as a modality. And please forgive me, now I do somatic therapies or something like that. I can't remember exactly how the joke went, but so yeah, like let's talk a little bit about somatic therapies, because I think you do several. So what types of somatic therapies do you do?
Yeah, so I'm trained in EMDR. I'm a certified brain spotting practitioner. And then I also use like polyvagal therapy and internal family systems, kind of like within all of that.
So you're intermixing IFS or internal family systems and integrating it into those other modalities?
Yeah, beautiful. Usually. Yeah. I think, I'm very much, even though those are the things that I primarily focus on, I'm also not, I joke and like crap on CBT all the time, but I also use that too. I'm very much like adaptive to where the client is and what speaks to them. So I don't know that there's anybody that I like only use that with, but yeah, I think that, I'm pretty open to kind of like adapting all of the tools that I have in my toolbox from all the years to just kind of structure it in a way that the client really resonates with it.
Yeah, I like that. So being able to flex according to what's in front of you and the need that's in front of you. So yeah, that's awesome. And if anybody's watching this and they notice I'm sweating profusely, it's because I'm in I'm in my shipping container gym. This is where I shoot. So just wanted to mention that if they think I'm having a heart attack or something. Okay, so within those modalities now here comes the hard-hitting question, Lauren. So within those modalities, which one works best? And this is going to go viral, so be careful. So no, I'm just kidding, but nothing I'm going to do is ever going to go viral. But yeah, which one do you? Yeah, I don't know. maybe. But which one do you feel like, if you had to pick one, which one would you use?
Oh, I would probably say brain spotting. That's the one that I tend to gravitate towards the most. Now, like I said earlier, I kind of like integrate things within brain spotting, but it is just like, I had a brain spotting session with a client this morning that I was like amazed at what was happening. And I've been doing it for years and it still like amazes me. And I just think it is so incredible that, I just absolutely love it.
Yeah. And so if you had a past story, if you're comfortable with sharing it, what would be one that really stands out to you that amazed you through brain spotting, you doing brain spotting with a client?
I think what I love about it is that you kind of never really know what you're going to get with it, because it's so much of like trusting the client's nervous system and brain to like go where it needs to go and do what it needs to do. And how people experience that is so different every time. And so, I mean, I don't know. It's like, you can't do it wrong. It's very just, it's kind of, like, I kind of think of it as like, you kind of are getting out of your own way to just let your brain heal in the way that it needs to. So I had this one was really interesting. I'll share a story where it was a client that had a lot of fear around like health related things, specifically around food and food allergens. And this client had been working with doctors for a long time and was trying to like figure out what was actually going on, because they would try different things that would kind of work, but like not really. And, just a lot of frustration that this client was having around just different like inflammation and breaking out into hives and allergic type reactions, and not really knowing why, which caused a lot of fear around food and eating and all of it. And, I don't even remember what we were targeting. We weren't targeting that. I remember we weren't targeting specifically like food fears. It was something completely different. We were targeting something more trauma related. And the client had, like, towards the end of the session, after, like, into the next day, maybe next couple days, like a similar kind of allergic reaction in their body, like breaking out into hives. And it freaked them out. They contacted me and they're like, the only thing that was different was that I did this brain spotting. And like, I was newer to brain spotting at the time. So I was like, I don't know, like, yikes, I don't know what that means. And so, I'm like asking my supervisors and the people in my brain spotting community, like, is this normal? Like, what did I do it wrong or whatever? And they were like, no, that's good. Like, that's like the body is like releasing like this inflammation. And yes, it feels scary. It feels bad, blah, 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 whatever, but it's not necessarily a bad thing. If this person for sure knows they didn't have anything that would have caused an allergic reaction, that's probably, and they gave me some research and some studies of things that had been done around that I shared with the client. And the next week, and I shared that with the client to make sure they knew, like, okay, like, this is what they say. They said it's okay. Just like keep going about your business. But they came back the next week and felt so much better. Like, body symptoms were still there a little bit, but like way better than they had been in like years. And that continued to be the case, that like, not only did the emotional kind of fears relax, but like literally, like, her body was like releasing this stuff and healing. And like, I mean, it's been, I don't know, 1.5 years, 2 years maybe since then. I still see her and it's not really been a thing. And so like, that was something that I'm like, okay, this is really cool. I kind of knew that, scientifically that could happen through that kind of a thing, but just seeing it so clear as day was just, I was like, okay, this stuff is like really cool.
Yeah. I think it's funny because a lot of the ones, in terms of like, if I had to pull up a memory like off the top of my head really quickly without thinking too much about it. It'd be one of my earlier ones too. And it was like, so working with this client, addiction, and then it worked with several therapists, and they all said abandonment. He was adopted as a infant. Like I think he was 1 or something.
Yep.
Adopted really young. So he's like, my parents were awesome. My parents took care of me. They stayed married. They were together, like, sure, there were some little things that happened here and there, but for the most part, like I felt loved, I still feel loved and all this. And so I'm like, let's just see what happens. And just surrender to letting his system do what it does and see if we can find an answer. And so went there, and he would go into this kind of like freeze state where he wouldn't talk very much. He'd kind of look off in the distance. His head would kind of kick back, and he would just do that on a spot. And he would lock in really quickly on spots. Like he was super fast. So he'd just do this and kind of lean back in this frozen state. And so I think this was maybe my second or third time doing brain spotting with him. And this was the first time we were addressing this particular theme of maybe let's see if there's abandonment and where that might be coming from. And so he's checking out the spot. He's quiet for a while, and then his eyes kind of blink. And he goes from this like kind of deadpan face to kind of like mouth agape. And then I'm like, just checking in. What's going on for you? And then a tear starts coming down one eye. He says, I'm in a crib. My diaper is full. I'm screaming for help. And he stops and he looks at me in the eye, which is always creepy when that happens. He stops, he looks at me in the eye. He goes, I'm at the orphanage. And then he goes back on the spot and he just starts crying, right? And he's having this pre-verbal memory come up when he's at the orphanage, and he's there, he's experiencing it, and he needs help, and nobody's coming to help him change his diaper. Crazy, right? I'm like, oh my gosh. Like I get out of this session, and I'm like, every time I bring it up, I get chills and stuff.
I have chills too.
Just this like
and that's why I love
experience.
Brain spotting, because like that client who's like, I had great family, I grew up whatever, like, if you do something like EMDR, I don't know how familiar you are with that, but like you kind of have to have some sort of identified trauma or some identified memory to focus on, whereas brain spotting is really just like, who knows if he would have ever actually had that connection, that he had any sort of trauma, if he didn't get out of his own way, so to speak. Yeah, that's what I love about it too. It's adaptability, like you said, integrating other modalities within it too is very easy to do. It's very fluid. So yeah, awesome. It's okay to get a little bit in depth here if you're comfortable with it. Some of the neurobiology, some of the psychology behind when people get stuck, they just can't move forward with something, challenges in front of them, extremely resistant to change, and people just get stuck. What's happening there? Yeah, I think a lot of times, because I specialize in those modalities, is I'll get clients that have had a lot of counseling, a lot of talk therapy, a lot of CBT, that kind of thing, which it's not like that's not been helpful for them. Maybe they've learned some really good coping skills. Maybe they've been able to make a lot of connections to why they do certain things, and that's helpful. But just because they know why, I don't know, they get anxious in social settings, for instance, maybe they've realized that's connected back to this major bullying event in high school or whatever. Just because they know that and have made those connections, or maybe have some things in place to make that easier, doesn't necessarily always mean that they can now go into social situations without the social anxiety, right? And so a lot of times that is where I'm getting those clients. And there's that kind of frustration of like, am I ever going to get over this? Can I get over this? Do I just have to, is this just like my life sentence? Do I have to just cope around this or avoid or whatever forever? And the answer is no. But, in terms of like the neurobiology around that, is talk therapy utilizes really the prefrontal cortex. So the, front part of your brain that is logical, that can tell a story, that can make sense of things, that can, form those connections, which is great. But when somebody's experiencing something really overwhelming or traumatic, that part of their brain is offline. Like they're operating usually from like more the brain stem back here, that more instinctual fight, flight, freeze, emotional part of their brain. Like that client you talked about who had the memory of being in the orphanage, like that little baby wasn't in the crib in the orphanage logically going, oh man, I'm hungry. And no, it's all instinctual. It's all emotional. It's all that deeper seated stuff. That client didn't have, active memory of that time. You don't really form actual active memory until typically around 5. And even then, there's a lot that goes into that. But, a baby doesn't have active memory. However, a baby's body, a baby's nervous system, a baby's brainstem is fully developed and experiencing safety or not being safe, all of these things around them. And so even though they can't form thoughts or tell a story about that time, their nervous system still absolutely experience that. And so in order to really heal that, it's kind of it's important to talk to the parts of the brain that were actually activated and online when that happened. And so that's really what things like brain spotting does, is it, our eyes are one of the first things that's developed in the womb. It's the only part of our brain that is connected to visually the outside world. The amount of information that we're taking in, a lot of that comes through our eyes. Where we look affects how we feel. All of that stuff is majorly important. And so, I think sometimes just on the surface, these certain modalities, these somatic things seem like a little bit woo-woo and a little bit like, what, I'm just going to stare at a stick and that's going to heal me. And it's yeah, but there's a ton of neurobiology beyond that. What is happening actually is there's tons of science to support it. It's not just this woo-woo thing. And I think sometimes it helps my clients when I'm able to describe that to them, because I don't know whether it creates a sense of trust for it or they're more open to it sometimes than just being I guess I'll stare at the stick. And some people are like, whatever, yeah, let's stare at the stick. I don't really need to know the brain science. And that's fine too. But yeah, I think that it is, and it works, obviously. I've seen it work, you've seen it work. And it's just really, I don't know. It's just this, it's how our brains are formed. It's how we function as humans. And, it's just a major part of our everyday life. And so, yeah, being able to understand that and why things get stuck the way that they do, can be really freeing.
So what is the impact on trauma and resilience? I know it's kind of broad, but what comes up for you when I ask that?
A couple things. I think that, again, when people sometimes are operating too much in their logical head in that prefrontal cortex, they spend a lot of time trying to make sense of things. And sometimes that looks like trying to rationalize things or talk themselves out of feeling, oh, well, I shouldn't be upset because so-and-so had it worse or whatever it is. And I don't know, an example that I use a lot when it comes to resilience is that, trauma at its core, it's not so much about what happened, the events around whatever the story is, as much as it's about how your body, your nervous system experienced the event. And there's a lot that goes into that. So if two people are driving in a car and there's a car accident, why is it that, if they get in the accident, everybody's fine, they get out, and one person is shooken up, but fine, thankful that they're not hurt, whatever, move on with their life. And the second person is just terrified to drive, doesn't want to get in a car, heart starts beating fast every time they hear a siren, whatever. It's like you experience the exact same event. So why is it that one person seems to be more resilient than the other? Why are they experiencing it completely differently? And if you try to just use logic to understand that, it doesn't make any sense. But it is about everything underneath the surface of that. So, I mean, it could be a ton of things. It could be so much, but, maybe the person who is really impacted by that. I mean, I talk a lot about like the window of tolerance. I don't know how much you're familiar with that. Yeah.
My clients have heard me say the window of tolerance at least, I don't know,
okay.
1,000 times each.
Good. Me too, because it's huge. It's so important.
It's the gateway of how I talk to them about resilience, is using window of tolerance as the model to show them that. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's how I see it too. It's basically how much, I guess, like capacity a person has, and everybody has a window of tolerance, how much capacity they have. And some people who've like experienced a lot of trauma or difficulty or have like a high stress lifestyle or whatever, their window is going to be a lot smaller. It's going to be harder to stay there. It's going to be harder to regulate. And then there's like all these other things on top of that. Like, if with even just like in that day, like if those two people in the car accident, if one of them had like a pretty relaxing good day and whatever, and the other one just, had a really terrible meeting with their boss and their bank account is running low and they're in an ongoing argument with their partner and they haven't ate all day or whatever, like all of these things, even if they have the same size window, it could even be like these circumstances from that day that's impacting where they're at on that scale. Like if one of them is pretty calm during the car accident going into it and the other one is already like in like a hyper aroused state, they're going to experience that differently. So, it's like all of these little building blocks that add up to how much resilience a person has. And a lot of those things, it's just the foundation, right? It's like they don't really have a lot of say over it. It doesn't necessarily mean one person is like weaker or more, I don't know, sensitive or whatever the case may be. It's just kind of like their makeup.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like you said, there's so many different factors that can go into it. Like you said, it could be two people, same window of tolerance, but one listened to a story of a car accident that was horrific when they were 5 years old and the other one didn't.
Sure. Yeah.
And then that event just happened to align with this previous, maybe subconscious memory or something that's embedded deep in there. And then here's this thing that just activated and became real. So yeah. And then the other part too that's interesting within that is the post-traumatic response, right? So the second person or the first person that didn't seem to have any problem with it initially, 3 years later, they're walking down the street, happens to be around the same month, same temperature, maybe around the same time of day. They're walking down the street and they hear wheels screeching, coming to a stop. And then all of a sudden, 3 years later, they're activated. They feel like they're going to crawl out of their skin and they have no idea why, because they don't consciously remember, oh, this is sparking up memories from this previous event. So yeah, just interesting how this happens to people, like even years later.
Well, and I also think there's an element in terms of resilience. I don't know, like I'll tell this quick story. When I used to see kids for a period of time, I would go into the school to see them just to make it easier. They didn't have to do transportation, whatever. And I was seeing this little girl at this grade school and I was like signing out at the office or signing in or whatever. And I gave the name of the little girl so they would call her down to the office. And the principal happened to be like walking by at that time. And the principal was like, oh, so-and-so, you're a counselor? Why are you here to see so-and-so? She's one of our brightest students. And I'm like, well, confidentiality. I'm not really going to tell you much, but it stuck with me because, this little girl was a really good student, very friendly, very bright, very, all of these things, and was currently experiencing like quite a bit of amount of trauma. And actually, like her way of coping with that trauma was like perfectionism and, getting the good grades and like being well liked. And like all of these things were her way. Those were like trauma responses for her, And so like outwardly, society would look at her and go like, wow, she's so resilient. Like if they heard her story, they'd be like, wow, like she must be so resilient. But actually, like, it was, those things were a result of the trauma, and that was causing a lot of like internal turmoil. And she wasn't okay. She put on a really good, happy face and outwardly looked okay. But, I think that's just it was a great reminder for me. I think it's a good reminder for anybody that like trauma doesn't always look like, or low resilience doesn't always look like the person who's like depressed or the person who is unable to function. Sometimes the most traumatized people are the most like high achieving and externally successful people.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Real quick for people who are watching or listening, is we mentioned the window of tolerance, and we don't have time to explain it thoroughly. What I'll do is in the description box, if this is the YouTube video you're watching or if it's on Spotify, what I'll do is I'll leave a link to a video where I explain the window of tolerance. This is a video I use for my clients. I went ahead and shot a really awkward video where I'm explaining in detail window of tolerance. And so that video, if you're interested in window of tolerance, I'll put in the description of this. But yeah, so
I think they should in schools. Like I just feel like everybody, like first grade, you should learn the window of tolerance.
Yeah. Okay, so speaking of window of tolerance, then just kind of jumping back into that, is how does one build it up?
Yeah. Well, I think, some of it varies person to person. You got all of your self-care stuff, right? That's important. But also I think that, like going back to the car accident example, if the person who is all shooken up and traumatized by that car accident, like refuses to ever drive again, won't get in a car with anybody, doesn't want to ever talk about it, like that's just going to keep them stuck there, And so part of it is, I guess, a little bit of like exposure therapy maybe, but like, allowing themselves to ease back into those situations and experience safety in those situations so that their system isn't automatically going into that overwhelm, hypoarousal mode, whatever it is. And, that's going to widen the window. Of course, there's still the knowledge that those things can happen and it's outside of their control. It's, it's a part of their history, but avoiding it just keeps it stuck and sometimes even makes it bigger. So that's part of it. I think, it's like you got to feel it to heal it, like really being able to challenge yourself in a way that feels safe and that feels okay. That doesn't mean that, in fact, somebody really shouldn't, if that were to happen to them, they shouldn't be like, all right, I'm going to go get in the car and I'm going to go drive in high speed traffic on the freeway in the pouring rain to like expose myself to that. Like, no, like that would be a lot. That would be really overwhelming. And that would probably be unsafe. Like that's not a good step, but to like ease into that in the way that does feel safe. Like, maybe it's, I don't know, just maybe not being in the car, but like just going on a bike ride where they pass that spot feels safe enough. And then that feels okay. You build up to it. Maybe then being like a passenger in the car in similar time of day or whatever, whatever it is that works up to that, that'll grow the window of tolerance. And also in terms of self-care, I mean, I could stand on a soapbox about that all day, but I won't. But I think like seeing your self-care through the lens of the window of tolerance, in the sense of, if you're really anxious, if you're really overwhelmed, if you're really angry, maybe, going and being social and hanging out with friends isn't the best self-care because you're already really activated. Maybe that's a good time to take a day off work and relax and take some time to unwind. And vice versa, if you're feeling really depressed and zoned out and numb, maybe that's not a good time to take a day off of work and relax. Maybe that's a good time to go spend time with friends, because that's going to bring you back towards your window. So being intentional about how you're spending your time, and just noticing too. I think half the battle is people even just noticing in their body, oh, I'm feeling overwhelmed, or I'm feeling this way. And, getting curious about why that is.
Yeah. Yeah, that's perfect. So, some of the things you're mentioning there, like easing into it, is so important, especially at the beginning stages. So when you and I are seeing somebody, the window is maybe shattered at this point. And then there's also domains, right? Like you're talking about the driving specifically. So there's certain domains and areas that, you might be excelling in some things.
Mm-hmm.
You might be doing really well in some things. And then there's certain domains where the window is the ability to avoid is so overwhelming,
Right.
So yeah, the way I try to tell clients is, eventually what we want you to do is fail, intentionally, very intentionally. We want to get you to the edge of that competency, so much so to where you're going to mess up sometimes and you're going to fail. But because it was intentional, and because there was a plan behind it, it wasn't just I'm going to go and wing it, but there was a plan behind it. Then there's lessons to take from it. So we can continue to work on that same path. And then that's expanding that window too. Okay. One of the things, I don't know if you've experienced this. I have personally in my own life and my own recovery. So I'm a combat veteran. I have PTSD. I'm also traumatic brain injury, which I wasn't aware of until a while later, maybe 4 or 5 years after the fact. I wasn't aware I had that. But one of the things that was challenging for me was having this PTSD gave me a sense of safety for the insecurities that I have.
Yeah.
It's almost like anything that I might be, or I might know that I'm not achieving at a way that I can be achieving at, well, I have an excuse for it, and it's this. And so it's this almost this weird place of I feel safe in this spot. And if I heal from it, then how scary is that? And now I don't have this identity thing that I can wrap my sense of safety around, And I've since seen this with clients where it might be depression, for example, where they've been very specific and intentional about doing more activities, getting just kind of building areas that they would prefer to avoid, and slowly over time that they're smiling, their affect is lit up, they're coming in, they're happy to see you. But then there would be this sense of I don't think I've healed from my depression yet. I don't think I'm healing from my depression. I think it's still there. There seems to be this challenge for some people, not everybody, but for some people, where it's hard for them to let go of this diagnosis, whatever it is, maladaptive behavior, whatever. It's hard for them to let go of that because that is a place of safety for them. Yep. Have you ever experienced that within your caseload?
Yeah, absolutely. In all sorts of different ways too. I think sometimes people unintentionally self-sabotage, or, something I see a lot too is when things start going well, maybe somebody is in a new relationship that's really healthy and it seems to be going really well or whatever, that there's so much discomfort around trusting that or letting it be, this fear of when's the other shoe going to drop? Because when their system is so accustomed to being elevated and there being like chaos or overwhelm or dysfunction or, whatever, toxicity in the relationships, that if this is the norm for them or has been for so long, when things are calm, it feels like a little bit like, is this real? Can I trust this? I actually felt more comfortable when things are up here. My husband, he's in the military as well, and he's a pilot. And so when he was in flight school, he's a helicopter pilot. So where we were stationed, you're just hearing rotor blades like literally all the time. Like it's just always there. It just becomes like the background noise. And then on Sunday, they didn't fly. So on Sunday, it was quiet and it was like eerie. Like it, I just like didn't even like it. It was like too quiet. It was so like, whereas somebody who had like never been in that environment, if they came and visited us on like a Tuesday, they might be like, man, it's so loud. How do you guys handle this? It's so annoying. And they're noticing it. And I'm like, I don't even notice it. And when it's gone, I'm like uncomfortable and unsettled. And like, I think a lot of times that is what it's like for people when they start to heal, or when there's like good things in their life, is there's like this very unsettled, like, this is uncomfortable. I feel like a turtle without a shell, it's very vulnerable feeling. And so, yeah, I think that part of that is helping like educate people on what that is. And that's part of the process. And, helping them put like language to that. And, the way that you move through that is by letting yourself experience it for what it actually is and not necessarily as a bad thing. And then over time, it can become more and more comfortable. But yeah, I definitely see stuff like that quite often. It's really common.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah. I haven't heard people talk about it very often. I don't hear people talk about this one particular phenomenon where people are unwilling to jump into this new reality yet. And like, they're just not ready yet. So, yeah. So I have some quotes that I want to read to you, and I want to get your thoughts on it as we end here. Somebody very wise obviously wrote them. So let's go through it. So the first quote is, I choose the discomfort of healing over the comfort of staying the same.
Yeah.
What is your thought on that?
Yeah. I mean, it's like, it's not, I don't know. It's like, it's not comfortable to lean into things and have to talk about things that are sometimes really hard, or to feel the really hard emotions. But for me, it's kind of like a choice of usually the comfort of things staying the same. And I say that in quotes. It's a comfort, but that doesn't mean it's good or the joyful or thriving. It's just, are you choosing basically to, whatever, live a life of mediocre happiness or like low well-being, or are you going to lean in and do the hard work so that you can live a life that's like more joyful?
The next quote I got to get your thoughts on. By the way, all these quotes came from your page. So
I was like, it sounds kind of familiar.
Okay, so the apology you're waiting for doesn't hold your healing.
Yeah. See, I feel like, when I was working in that crisis agency, I would go to court a lot of times with people, or they were actively involved in some court cases. And I think sometimes people would hold on to this, like, well, once I get the conviction, or once, there's a sentence that once somebody's in jail, then I'll feel better. And, that wasn't always the case. And I think, understanding that like you are, the only thing you can control is your own healing and what you do. And, there are obviously situations where, let's say, talking about abuse specifically, like if an offender dies, like you're not going to get an apology. You just won't, or there's zero contact or whatever the case may be. Like it's not always an option, but those people can still absolutely heal too. So it's not contingent upon that. And really, I think that can be kind of freeing for people to realize that it's actually within their own control to process stuff and figure out, internally what is causing them to stay stuck in all this stuff, and not having it be contingent upon something that's completely outside of anything that they can control, which is hard. But
yeah.
yeah.
I think it's an important aspect in my world, in the addiction world.
Yeah.
As you work through the 12 steps, you work on part of this, which is essentially forgiveness, and having to learn not the general understanding of forgiveness, but the more important understanding of forgiveness, which would be like, it's not letting them off the hook, it's letting you off the hook of
Right.
the past trauma, or the past thing that happened that you're holding resentment over. And so there's plenty of times where it's like, okay, well, I'm working through my fourth step, or I'm working through my third step, and I can't, like, there's no way to work this out because Uncle so-and-so who did this thing to me is now dead. And so what do I do with it? It's an important piece to say, okay, even if Uncle so-and-so was still alive,
Right.
your healing doesn't come from his asking for forgiveness. Actually, it might even it might re-trigger you to have interaction with Uncle so-and-so,
Uncle so-and-so could not hear you, or Uncle so-and-so could hear you and apologize, and you could still feel really crappy, right? So it's an important distinction to make.
Okay, next one. I like this one. Okay. And I say something similar to this, but not in a very concise, fun way. Okay, so before you flip out, find out.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because I think, oftentimes I'll have people, playing out these scenarios in their head, or like, assuming things, or whatever the case may be. And sometimes there's literally no reason for that. And they're just, kind of causing themselves anguish, because they're letting themselves go down this road of these what ifs, or telling themselves whatever the story is that they're telling themselves. And sometimes there's like no evidence to support that. It's not even accurate at all. Sometimes it is, whatever. But sometimes it's very simple. It's just finding out, hey, what did you mean by that when you said that the other day? And that could just be gone. So.
Yep. Yeah. It's a lot of it can be figured out just through like another question or two for people, just to ask another question or two. But yeah, you said the right word there, assumptions, these assumptions. And if anxiety eats itself based off of some fear, then the anxiety that can get ramped up through something like that can get brutal.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, so the last one. Why do I feel like I had another one, which was like, where was the quote that I even I was all excited about when I read, and I don't have it written here.
I'm sure it was super profound.
It was profound. It was, I promise you. It was something about resilience, and that was the quote that I heard where I'm like, oh, I got to see if I can get her on the show. Okay. Okay, well, somehow I missed it. Okay, so here's the last quote. Not everything that feels like rejection is a rejection.
Yeah. Well, I think that can look a lot of different ways. Sometimes people just tell themselves it's a story that it's a rejection when it's actually not, and sometimes whatever feels like rejection is actually because your nervous system is remembering something else from other times in your life that were rejection that feels similar in your system, when that's not actually the situation at hand. So, and sometimes, it's like things that feel like a rejection too, it can be best for you, or be a really good thing. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. That last one you mentioned is like the next step outward. Like, you're probably, if you're fear is rejection, then that's probably not going to be helpful advice at the beginning, like blessing in disguise type thing, But it is very true so often, where like for me, when there were things that I was holding on most tightly to and just wanting to control, unwilling to surrender, but having to because I didn't have control over it, even though I wanted to, those were the things where it's like my life would look 100% different if I was able to control that situation. My life wouldn't be what it is today. It just wouldn't be, So I really like that aspect of rejection. Yeah. That's all I got. That's all I got today. I loved having you on. This is great. I think it was fun because this was the first one where I get to talk with somebody who's also working in the field of trying to help people become more resilient. And so being able to bring a psychology side to it, I think is important for the listeners or the viewers. So I really appreciate it.
Yeah. I hope it resonates with people and, hopefully can normalize some things that people are feeling or experiencing.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Lauren, for coming on the Patina'd Podcast. Loved having you on. Thank you so much. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Patina'd Podcast. There are other shows that emphasize resilience, but my intent is to normalize personal development through embracing challenge by interviewing the common man and woman, the person that you and I can relate to. If you are someone who wants to soak up the insights of normal people doing extraordinary things, please subscribe. If you know somebody who is overwhelmed by fear and complacency, please share this podcast with them. I'm your host, Kenny Hill, and I run a private practice near Sacramento, California called Recovery Hill. My website is in the description tab along with my social media links. The intro music was A Two in the Back, performed by Sunday at Slim's on Blue Dot Sessions.